The story begins in the cold stone corridors of a monastery hidden deep in the Balkan mountains. The nuns of St. Magdalena's had long lived in peace, their chants rising with the morning sun, their candles flickering like fragile souls in a world consumed by war. But as the Ottoman banners advanced westward, peace became a ghost of memory. Rumors traveled faster than the soldiers themselves. Villages burned. Bells rang not for prayer, but as alarms, and in every whisper, there was one dreadful certainty. The empire was coming. To the villagers, the Ottomans were not just an army, they were a storm that changed everything it touched. For centuries, their expansion had been unstoppable, stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna. And now, as their frontier reached deeper into Christian lands, ancient monasteries became symbols of defiance, quiet fortresses of a faith that refused to kneel. Inside St. Magdalena's, the sisters continued their prayers, their trembling hands clutching rosaries, unaware that each bead they counted was a moment closer to destiny. Among them was Sister Helena, a woman known for her courage and her voice, a voice that once filled the chapel with hope. She had seen the empire's reach before. As a child, she'd watched Ottoman soldiers march through her village, leaving nothing but ashes. She'd joined the monastery, not to hide, but to keep faith alive. But faith, in those times, came with a price. "If they come," whispered Mother Superior one night, "we will not run. We will not scream. We will become our prayers." Outside the monastery walls, the land itself seemed to brace for the inevitable. The air grew heavy. Villagers packed what little they had and fled into forests, hoping the Ottomans would pass them by. But the empire's scouts had already marked the monastery. To them, these isolated holy places were more than spiritual sanctuaries. They were symbols of resistance, repositories of Christian wealth, and potential threats to Ottoman authority. As the sun set behind the mountains, the sisters gathered for what they did not yet know would be their final Vesper service. The chants echoed softly through the hall's Latin hymns carried by voices trembling with devotion and dread. Kyrie, eleison, they sang, Lord have mercy. Outside, distant torches flickered through the mist. That night, Helena stood by the narrow window, her eyes searching the horizon. And then she saw it, a long, unbroken line of lights, moving like a river of fire through the valley. It wasn't a vision. It was the Ottoman vanguard. She froze, gripping the stone sill until her hands bled. The empire had found them. At dawn, the monastery bells tolled not in celebration, but warning. The Ottomans had arrived. Dust rose in clouds as riders approached, their banners marked with the crescent moon, their silence more terrifying than any battle cry. The sisters gathered in the courtyard, clutching their crosses, refusing to flee. Mother Superior raised her hand. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "remember who you are." What followed was not a battle. It was a conquest of the spirit. The Ottomans did not need to destroy every monastery with fire. They broke them by unmaking what they stood for. The empire had long understood that conquering faith was more powerful than conquering walls. And so they imposed new laws. No Christian could rebuild without imperial permission. No priest could preach without paying tax. And every holy order was watched. The sisters were herded from their sanctuary, their relics confiscated, their chapel sealed. To the Ottomans, this was administrative order, a means to ensure loyalty. But to the nuns, it was a living death. Their prayers had become whispers behind locked doors. Their habits were stripped of meaning. They were alive, but their purpose had been taken from them. Helena tried to keep hope alive, leading secret prayers in the night, carving crosses into the stone walls where no one would see. Yet, with each passing day, the empire's grip tightened. Soldiers camped nearby, their presence a reminder that even silence was dangerous. The sisters were ordered to work in the fields under supervision. Some vanished during those dark weeks, taken to unknown places under imperial decree. The others were told they had been transferred, though none ever returned. For the empire, this was control. For the sisters, it was despair. To the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. The Ottoman administration reported peace and stability. But within those walls, faith was unraveling thread by thread. What the Ottomans did to them was not with blades or chains. It was psychological. They dismantled what gave these women their strength, their faith, their unity, their voice. As winter came, the monastery stood cold and hollow, its windows broken, its chapel silent. Yet Helena refused to surrender her belief. "If they take our voices," she said, "we will pray with our hearts. If they take our home, we will make one in our souls." Her words became a secret vow among the remaining sisters. Even in silence, they would not forget who they were. In the empire's records, St. Magdalena's was marked as assimilated. To the Ottomans, it was a victory, another symbol of rebellion subdued. But to the world beyond those mountains, it became a legend, the tale of women who faced the greatest empire of their age, not with swords, but with unbroken faith. Years later, travelers passing through the ruins spoke of hearing faint singing at dusk, a ghostly choir rising from the stones. Some said it was the wind. Others swore it was the voices of those who had once prayed there, still keeping vigil in the land that forgot them. For in the end, what the Ottomans did to those nuns was not simply to conquer their land. They tried to erase their faith, their names, their memory. But memory has a way of surviving. Even centuries later, the story of Saint Magdalena's endures, not as tragedy, but as testimony. A reminder that sometimes, the worst fate is not death, but being forced to live without the soul that once gave you life. The monastery's fall marked not just the end of a sanctuary, but the birth of silence that echoed across generations. When the Ottomans took Saint Magdalena's, they didn't destroy its walls, they destroyed what those walls represented. Across the Balkans, and through the spine of Eastern Europe, similar scenes unfolded like chapters of a grim book written by empires. Each monastery, each church, each small flicker of Christian faith was systematically dimmed, not through massacre, but through policy, taxation, and fear. It was conquest with parchment and decree rather than fire and sword. Sister Helena and the remnants of her order were moved to a nearby town under Ottoman control. They were not imprisoned in the traditional sense, there were no chains, no barred windows, but they lived under a different kind of captivity, the captivity of submission. Their monastery was converted into an Ottoman outpost, its bells melted down to make musket balls, its library preserved in imperial archives. To the nuns, every echo of that place lived on as a wound that never closed. The Ottoman world was complex, a vast empire built on order, loyalty, and tribute. The sultans allowed many faiths to exist, but under the millet system, these faiths existed only by permission, not by right. Christians could keep their religion, but were marked by it. They paid extra taxes, could not bear arms, and were often called upon to provide their brightest children as tribute to the empire. The very thought of that practice, the devshirm, the blood tax, haunted every Christian family. It was said that even the nuns prayed not for salvation, but that their nephews and brothers would not be taken to serve the sultan. Sister Helena, older now, found herself teaching children in secret, passing on prayers and hymns disguised as songs. What the empire forbade publicly, she kept alive quietly. The Ottomans were masters of control. They allowed fragments of faith to exist, only to prevent rebellion. Yet, deep beneath the layers of compliance, rebellion simmered. For the women who once belonged to Saint Magdalena's, resistance no longer meant fighting, it meant remembering. The years crawled by like a long winter. The old crosses of the region were replaced by crescents on new domes. Markets bustled, soldiers patrolled, and the empire thrived. To outsiders, the Ottoman lands were a miracle of stability. But behind closed doors, there were countless small acts of defiance, scandals lit in secret, psalms whispered under breath, tiny icons hidden inside walls. Helena and her surviving sisters became symbols of that quiet defiance. Though the world never knew their names, one evening, as the call to prayer echoed through the town, Helena sat by a window, her eyes fixed on the distant hills where the ruins of Saint Magdalena's still stood. She imagined the stones glowing faintly under the moonlight, as though still alive. "They think they erased us," she murmured, "but a soul cannot be erased by decree." The younger sisters listened in silence. In her frail voice, they heard not despair, but endurance, the same endurance that had carried their order through the centuries of storm. In the broader empire, the Ottomans believed their system was merciful. Compared to the brutalities of other conquerors, theirs was an empire of tolerance. But tolerance has edges as sharp as any blade. It was the tolerance of the master, allowing the servant to live, so long as he never forgot his place. Christian communities learned to survive through compromise. They built their churches below ground or in valleys unseen from the main roads. They baptized their children at night, under candlelight and watchful eyes. Each act of faith became both worship and rebellion. Then came the famine, years of time, when crops failed, taxes rose, and hope thinned, like smoke. The empire demanded more tribute, and the Christian peasants suffered first. The Ottoman officials visited towns to collect levies, and with them came soldiers who took what they pleased. It was in this chaos that Helena and her sisters saw the truth, that the empire could command obedience, but not faith. Faith belonged to those who suffered and still believed. Helena began recording her memories, scratching words into pieces of parchment she hid inside clay jars. "If we vanish," she wrote, "let it be known that we once sang." Those words, centuries later, would be found by travelers, giving historians a glimpse of their world, not one of open violence, but of slow erasure. The story of Saint Magdalena's wasn't about martyrdom. It was about survival under suffocation. The empire's control reached even the smallest details of daily life. Christian children could not attend certain schools. They could not ride horses before Muslim men. Their bells could not ring louder than the muezzin's calls. These were not punishments of blood but of spirit-entile humiliations, repeated until identity itself bent. The empire didn't destroy faith, it reshaped it. And in that reshaping, countless souls were left hollow. Yet, some Ottoman governors, impressed by the nuns' quiet resilience, showed compassion. One local bey, it was said, secretly allowed Helena to rebuild a small chapel behind his estate, under the condition that it bore no cross on its roof. She agreed. "God," she said, "needs no symbol to be seen." There, in that hidden chapel, the sisters sang again softly, cautiously, as if afraid to wake the empire itself. That moment became legend. Even in chains, faith had found its whisper. Years melted into decades. The Ottoman world shifted, rulers changed, borders moved, and wars came and went. But the small remnant of St. Magdalena's endured through generations. The original sisters passed away quietly, one by one, leaving their stories behind like seeds buried in the dark. Their final prayers weren't for victory, but for memory that someone, someday, would remember what they endured, and why. Centuries later, when historians walked among the ruins of forgotten monasteries, they found faint inscriptions etched into walls. One read, "We lived in silence, but the silence was alive." Another bore Helena's mark, a simple cross, carved beneath the Ottoman date stamp, defying the passage of time. It was a small rebellion that outlived empires. What the Ottomans did to those nuns wasn't measured in wounds or deaths, but in what they took away: the freedom to believe openly, to sing without fear, to live as themselves. They turned worship into an act of courage. They made silence the new language of faith, and in doing so, they created something unintended, a generation that believed more deeply because they had suffered more greatly. As the empire began to wane in its later centuries, the memory of such oppression became the fuel for uprisings across Europe. Nations that had knelt for centuries began to rise, carrying with them not just swords, but stories like that of St. Magdalena's. Helena's name faded into legend, but her defiance became part of the spirit of resistance that would one day shatter the empire's hold on Christian lands. And so, long after her death, Sister Helena's legacy lived on, not in glory or vengeance, but in remembrance. Her prayers had crossed centuries. Her courage had become history. The Ottomans believed they had broken her order, but in truth, they had made it eternal, because faith born in freedom can fade, but faith forged in suffering becomes unbreakable. When empires fall, they rarely crumble all at once. They fade stone by stone, law by law, until only echoes remain. And when the Ottoman Empire began its long decline, those echoes stirred the ghosts of its forgotten victims. In the Balkans, the Danube valleys, and the mountains of Macedonia, people whispered again the stories they had once been forced to bury. Among them was a name barely remembered: St. Magdalena's, the monastery that had vanished in silence but refused to die in memory. 3 centuries after Sister Helena's time, a young scholar named Miroslav Petrovic set out to document the ruins of lost Christian sites across the old Ottoman provinces. The empire was gone now, replaced by new nations still haunted by its shadow. Miroslav had grown up hearing fragments of a tale from his grandmother, a story of nuns who sang through captivity. He never believed it fully. It sounded too poetic to be real, but something about that legend drew him north, toward a range of mist-covered hills the locals still called the Sisters' Valley. The path was overgrown, the forests wild again. Only when he reached a clearing did he see them: half-buried stones, outlines of walls, and the faint curve of an arch still clinging to the sky. There, amid moss and silence, stood what little was left of St. Magdalena's. Birds nested where bells had once hung. Ivy wrapped the altar like a shroud. Yet there was a strange order to the ruin, as if the earth itself had preserved it in mourning. He set up camp beside the old refectory and began to dig. Day after day, he uncovered fragments: clay jars, scorched icons, pieces of pottery marked with crosses that had been deliberately scratched out. And then, buried beneath a collapsed stairwell, he found a sealed amp. Inside were brittle scrolls wrapped in linen. The writing was faint, but legible: "If we vanish, let it be known that we once sang." Miroslav felt his pulse race. It wasn't just a myth, it was history speaking across centuries. The words belonged to Sister Helena herself. Her voice, lost to the empire, had found its way into his hands. Each line revealed a world suffocated but unbroken. She had written of the fear, the silence, the endless watching, but also of faith that refused to die. "They thought they ended us," one passage read, "but faith is a seed. Even buried in darkness, it waits for light." The discovery spread quickly. Scholars came from across Europe to read Helena's words. Newspapers called her the Silent Saint, and St. Magdalena's became a symbol not of vengeance, but of resilience. The ruins turned into a pilgrimage site. Christians, Muslims, and even secular travelers came to walk among the stones and listen to the wind that seemed at dusk to hum a distant hymn. The empire that had tried to silence her now became the reason her story was known to the world. But Miroslav noticed something deeper. In Helena's final entries, she had written, not with anger, but with compassion for her captors. "We prayed for them," she wrote, "for they, too, were trapped, bound by fear of rebellion, chained by their own empire's hunger." Those words stunned readers. She had transcended hatred. Her forgiveness had outlived her torment. Historians debated how to interpret this. Some said Helena's compassion was a survival tactic. Others believed it genuine, that in her suffering she had glimpsed a truth larger than both cross and crescent. Whatever the case, her writings forced the world to see that the line between conqueror and conquered was more fragile than anyone dared admit. Over the next decades, St. Magdalena's was carefully restored, not rebuilt to its former glory, but preserved exactly as Miroslav found it: half ruin, half resurrection. Beneath the cracked arch, they placed a marble plaque inscribed with Helena's words: To lose faith is to die twice. We lived once more through remembrance. Visitors would kneel there in silence. Some lit candles, others left notes, but all felt the same chill of history breathing down their necks, a reminder that cruelty, however hidden behind policy or empire, never truly destroys the spirit of those who endure it. As years passed, filmmakers and historians told Helena's story in countless forms, each retelling darker, yet more beautiful than the last. Yet none could capture the moment Miroslav described best. The night he heard singing. He had stayed alone one evening, cataloging relics under lamplight. When the wind rose through the valley, it carried with it a faint harmony, soft, wordless, impossibly human. He wrote later, perhaps it was wind through the stones, or perhaps some prayers never stop echoing. St. Magdalena's became a metaphor for every silenced voice. Churches and schools across Eastern Europe taught the story not as an indictment of a people or faith, but as a testament to the cost of power. Even Turkish historians began to revisit their own archives, acknowledging the empire's darker shadows with newfound honesty. In that, Helena achieved something no conqueror ever had. She united those once divided by history. And still, questions remained. Who were the sisters who disappeared? Were they executed, converted, or scattered into new lives under new names? No one could know. The empire had erased their records. But in a sense, that mystery became part of their immortality. For as long as their names were unknown, anyone who suffered in silence could see themselves in their story. Miroslav died an old man, buried at the foot of the monastery hill. His tombstone bore a single inscription: he listened. In his final letter, he wrote, "Empires die when memory lives." Today, if you visit the site at dusk, you can still see candlelight flickering through the windows of the rebuilt chapel. Locals say that on certain nights, when mist rolls down the mountain, you can hear the faint tolling of a bell, though no bell hangs there anymore. Some say it's legend. Others swear it's proof that the past never truly dies. The story of St. Magdalena's is not a tale of revenge, but of endurance. It reminds us that the worst things done in history often weren't acts of sudden violence, but long years of silence imposed upon those who dared to believe differently. The Ottomans did not destroy the nuns with swords. They tried to unmake their faith, and yet, in doing so, they proved the very thing they sought to erase: that belief, once forged in suffering, can survive any empire. As the camera of history pulls back, we see the ruins surrounded by new life, children playing, birds nesting, sunlight piercing through broken arches. Empires fall, regimes vanish, but the echoes of faith remain. Somewhere in that wind, the voices of Helena and her sisters still whisper, "We are the ones who prayed in silence, and silence remembered." And that is how their story ends, not with death, but with endurance that even centuries could not silence. Subscribe line for your channel. If this story moved you, if history's forgotten voices still speak to your heart, then subscribe to our channel for more dark historical documentaries that reveal the untold truths hidden beneath time's dust.